Would you marry me?" The words cracked across the town square like a rifle shot, and 300 people stopped breathing at once. Grace Holloway stood in front of Elias Blackwood, the most feared man in all of Montana Territory. Her chin lifted, her hands trembling at her sides. The same crowd that had been laughing at her a heartbeat ago now waited hungry for him to break her in two. Instead, the man slowly reached up and took off his hat. And everything in that town changed forever. If you love stories, we're the people. Everyone counted out, finally rise, subscribe, and follow this one, all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The laughter had started long before Grace ever reached the square that morning. It started as it always did at the wash line behind Dunmore's Mercantile, where two of the merchant's daughters leaned against the rail and watched her haul a basket of wet sheets twice her own weight. "Careful, Grace," the older one called out sweetly. "You'll snap that line right off the post." "Or the post off the ground," the younger one added, and they both dissolved into giggles. Grace did not look up. She had learned a long time ago that looking up only gave them what they wanted. She pinned the first sheet, then the second, her fingers raw and red from lye soap, and she let the words slide off her, the way she'd taught herself to let everything slide off her quietly, without a sound, without a flinch. "My mother says," the older girl went on louder, now making sure Grace could hear, "that the only way a woman like you ever gets a husband is if the Lord strikes every other woman blind first." "That's cruel, Annette," the younger one said, delighted. "It's the truth." Grace pinned a third sheet. Her hands did not shake. She would not let them shake. "How old are you now, Grace?" Annette asked. 26. "My grandmother was a grandmother twice over by 26. "Leave her be," said a third voice, and Grace finally lifted her head. It was Hattie Voss, the widow who took in mending 2 doors down, an old woman bent like a question mark with a tongue sharp enough to skin a cat. She came shuffling along the alley with a bundle under one arm, and she fixed the merchant's daughters with a look that could have curdled milk. "You two haven't done an honest hour's work between you since the day you were born," Hattie said. "Go on, go bother somebody who's got time to be bothered." The girls rolled their eyes and drifted off, but not before Annette tossed one last word over her shoulder. "Big day in the square this afternoon, Grace. The mayor's bringing in husbands. You ought to come. Might be one so desperate he doesn't mind." And then they were gone, and it was just the 2 women and the snapping wet linen. "You shouldn't let them talk to you that way," Hattie said. "It doesn't cost me anything to let them," Grace answered. "It costs you plenty. I can see it costing you right now." Grace bent for another sheet. "What's this about the mayor and husbands?" Hattie snorted. "You haven't heard. It's all anyone's talked about for a week. Mayor Crane's got himself a notion. Says there's too many lonely men out on the ranches and too many lonely women in town, and he's going to play matchmaker for the good of the territory." She said good of the territory the way a person might say good of my own pocket. "Bringing in 3 or 4 of these big landowners this afternoon. Wealthy men looking for wives. They'll stand up there like prize bulls at auction, and the women'll line up and bat their eyes. And you think it's a sham?" "I think anything Mayor Crane sets his hand to has got money under it somewhere," Hattie said. "But what do I know? I'm just an old woman." Grace pinned the last sheet and wiped her hands on her apron. For a long moment she said nothing. "You're thinking about going," Hattie said. "No." "You are. I can see it on your face. And what if I am?" Grace turned on her, and there was a heat in her voice she hadn't meant to let out. "What if I am, Hattie? Should I just keep washing other people's sheets until I'm bent over like you and my hands are nothing but bone? Is that the future I'm supposed to be grateful for?" Hattie didn't flinch. She'd buried 2 husbands and outlived every soul who'd ever pitied her, and she wasn't about to be shocked by a laundress with fire in her belly. "No," the old woman said quietly. "That's not the future you're supposed to be grateful for. But I'll tell you something for free, child. If you walk into that square this afternoon, those men aren't going to see you the way you see yourself. They're going to see a heavy girl with chapped hands and a dead father and not 1 cent to her name, and they are going to laugh. I know, Grace said. You know, and you're going anyway. I'm going anyway. Hattie looked at her a long moment. Then she reached out, and with a gentleness that didn't match her face, tucked a loose strand of hair back behind Grace's ear. Then you go, she said. And you stand up straight. And you don't give a single one of them the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. By 2 o'clock, the square was full. They'd built a little platform out of crates and planks in front of the mayor's office, and Mayor Crane stood up on it in his good waistcoat, with his thumbs hooked in the pockets, beaming down at the crowd, like a man who'd already counted his money. Beside him stood the bachelors, 3 of them, just as Hattie had said. Fine coats, polished boots, the soft, well-fed look of men who'd never pinned a wet sheet in their lives. Friends, Crane boomed. Friends and neighbors of Cottonwood Bend. It is a glorious day for our young territory. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. We are a community blessed with hard-working men and virtuous women, Crane went on. But the good Lord in his wisdom has scattered us across a great deal of empty country. And it has come to my attention that some of our finest ranchers' men of property, men of standing, find themselves without the comfort of a wife. He swept a hand toward the 3 men. And so I say, why should distance keep 2 willing hearts apart? Today, we put an end to that. The crowd applauded. Grace stood near the back in the shade of the dry goods awning, her hands folded in front of her, and she watched. She watched the first bachelor step forward, a thick-necked man named Pruitt, who ran cattle south of the river, and she watched the unmarried women of the town go still with attention. She watched a banker's daughter named Lucy Crane, the mayor's own niece, glide to the front in a blue dress that cost more than Grace earned in a year. She watched the way the men looked at Lucy, the way they looked at the pretty ones, the way their eyes slid right over everyone else like water over stone. Now, Crane said, any young woman who wishes to be considered, step forward and let these fine gentlemen see your face. There's no shame in it. There's no shame in honest hope. And one by one they came. The pretty ones first, then the plain ones, then a few of the widows. They lined up in front of the platform, and the 3 men looked them over, and Grace watched the whole thing from the back, with her heart going harder and harder in her chest. Step forward, a voice in her said. You came all this way. Step forward. They'll laugh, said another voice. Let them laugh. She took 1 step, then another. And by the time the 3rd step came, people had begun to notice, and the murmur started low and ugly, the way it always started. Is she? She's not actually going to. Oh Lord, somebody stop her. Grace walked to the front of the line. She stood before the platform with her chapped hands folded and her chin up exactly the way Hattie had told her, and she waited. The thick-necked rancher Pruitt looked at her. He looked at her boots and her work-worn dress and the strong, wide shoulders she'd built hauling water and wet linen, and the soft, round face that had never once in her life been called pretty by anyone who meant it. And then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. That was almost worse. It was the easy, careless laugh of a man who simply could not imagine the thing in front of him being serious, the way a man might laugh if a chicken wandered up and tried to shake his hand. Well now, Pruitt said. What have we got here? My name is Grace Holloway, Grace said. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, I can keep a house, I can mend, I can manage a garden and tend stock and read and figure sums. I'm asking to be considered. The second bachelor leaned over and said something to the third behind his hand, and the third one grinned. Considered? Pruitt repeated, and now the laugh was spreading out into the crowd behind her, rolling outward like a stone dropped in a pond. For what exactly a man's got to be able to lift his bride over the threshold, sweetheart? I'd put my back out. The crowd roared. Grace felt it go through her like cold water, every face, every open mouth, every shaking shoulder. She felt her own face go hot. She kept her chin up, she kept her hands folded. She did not bleed where they could see it. But Mayor Crane up on his platform was not laughing. Grace saw that even through the noise. The mayor's smile had gone thin, and his eyes had gone flat, and he was watching her the way a man watches a dog that has wandered somewhere it isn't supposed to be. Now, Crane said, raising his hands, smoothing it all over. Miss Holloway, was it? I commend your spirit, I do. But perhaps this particular occasion isn't quite. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable. Why don't you ask Blackwood? The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, and Grace didn't see who said it, but she didn't have to. The whole square seemed to catch its breath and then explode. Blackwood. Ask Blackwood. He's mean enough to take her. He's the only man in the territory'd be a fair match. They could scare each other to death. Go on, girl. Go ask the butcher of Bitter Creek. And there, at the very edge of the square, standing alone beside a tall gray horse, the way he always stood alone everywhere, was the man they were all pointing at. Grace had seen Elias Blackwood before. Everyone in Cottonwood Bend had seen him at a distance, the way you'd see a thunderhead building over the mountains, something you noted and then hurried indoors away from. He came into town maybe 4 times a year, bought what he needed without a word more than was necessary, and rode back up into the high country where no sane person followed. He was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a hard, weathered face and a jaw like a closed door, and there were stories about him. Stories about outlaws who'd ridden up to his place looking for easy plunder and never ridden back down. Stories about the scars he carried. Stories nobody could swear were true, and nobody dared ask him to confirm. He stood now with one hand on his horse's neck, his hat pulled low, and he was looking at the crowd with an expression of perfect, terrible stillness. "Go on, Grace!" Annette Dunmore shrieked, from somewhere half hysterical with laughter. "There's your husband. Go ask him." And Grace, standing there with 300 people braying at her, understood with sudden awful clarity that this was the moment. That whatever she did in the next 10 seconds, she would carry for the rest of her life. She could turn and walk away, with the laughter chasing her down every street. Or she could do the most foolish thing a woman had ever done in the history of Cottonwood Bend. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. Grace turned, and she began to walk across the square toward the most feared man in Montana Territory. The laughter changed as she walked. It rose at first gleeful, certain she was playing along with the joke. But as the distance closed, as it became clear, she was not stopping, not slowing. Walking straight and steady, right up the open lane, the crowd parted to make for her. The laughter began to thin, to falter, to go nervous at the edges. Because Elias Blackwood was not laughing. He watched her come the whole way, that gray gaze fixed on her, and only her. And he did not move, and he did not smile. And there was something in his absolute stillness that made the back of every neck in that square prickle. Grace stopped 6 feet from him, close enough now to see that the stories were true. The scar that ran up from his collar along the side of his throat, the deeper lines around his eyes that no 37-year-old man should have. Close enough to feel how big he was, how the air around him seemed heavier. Her heart was slamming so hard, she thought he must be able to hear it. "Say it. You came all this way. Say it." "Mr. Blackwood," she said. He said nothing. "My name is Grace Holloway." He said nothing. The whole square had gone nearly silent now, 300 people leaning in, straining to hear. Grace took a breath that went all the way down to the soles of her feet. She looked up into that hard, unreadable face, and she gathered up every scrap of courage she had ever owned, and she spoke the words that would break the town. "Would you marry me?" For 1 full second, nobody made a sound. Then the square erupted louder than before, wild, cruel, a great wave of laughter that crashed over Grace's shoulders and seemed to go on forever. Somewhere a woman was actually screaming with it. Somewhere Pruitt the rancher was bent double, slapping his knee. And Elias Blackwood stood in the middle of it all, looking down at Grace, and he did not laugh. The seconds stretched. 5. 10. The laughter began to die on its own, the way a fire dies when there's nothing left to feed it, because the man at the center of the joke would not play his part. He simply stood there and looked at the woman in front of him, and slowly, so slowly, the whole town watched it happen. He reached up and took off his hat. He held it against his chest. A thing a man did at a funeral. A thing a man did before something that deserved respect, and in the great new silence of the square, in a low, rough voice that carried farther than any shout, Elias Blackwood said one word. Yes. The laughter did not just stop. It vanished. It was as if someone had reached into the throat of the entire town and pulled the sound out by the root. Mayor Crane's mouth came open. The three bachelors on the platform stared. Annette Dunmore's face had frozen halfway through a giggle ugly and slack. And Grace Holloway stood 6 feet from the most feared man in the territory and felt the whole world tip sideways under her. "Whoa!" She started and found she had no air. "What did you say?" "I said yes." Elias's gaze had not left her. "If you meant it." Grace's hands had come unfolded. She didn't know what to do with them. "I meant it." "Then yes." A voice broke the silence. Crane's high and sharp, scrambling up out of the wreckage of his nice afternoon. "Now hold on. Hold on just a minute, Blackwood. This is a respectable gathering, and I won't have it made a mockery of." "You won't have it made a mockery of." Elias finally looked away from Grace and turned that flat gray stare up onto the platform, and the mayor's words shriveled in his mouth. "Funny thing to say, Crane. Seeing as you stood up there and let your whole town make a mockery of this woman not 2 minutes ago, and your only complaint was that she ought to be more comfortable about it. That is not—" "She stood up in front of God and everybody and asked to be considered," Elias said. And though he never raised his voice, something underneath it made men take a half step back. "I'm considering her. That's all anybody asked for. Or is the trouble that somebody actually said yes?" Crane's face had gone a blotchy red. He looked out at the crowd at the faces that had been so willing to laugh a moment ago, and now didn't know where to look. And Grace watched the mayor make a fast, hard calculation behind his eyes. Watched him decide that this was not the hill that there was nothing to be won, by fighting the butcher of Bitter Creek in front of the whole town. "This is highly irregular," Crane managed. "It's a man and a woman agreeing to marry," Elias said. "It's the oldest regular thing there is." He set his hat back on his head. Then he turned to Grace, and for just a moment, for just the length of a breath, the hard face changed. Not into a smile. Nothing so simple as that. But into something quieter. Something almost like a question. "You'll want to think on it," he said low, just for her. "What just happened here, folks won't forget it. They'll talk. They'll say things about you that aren't true and never were. If you want to take back what you said, now's the time, and I won't hold it against you. Not for 1 minute." And there it was. The door left open. The easy way out, offered to her by the one man in the square. Nobody would have expected to offer her anything at all. Grace looked up at him. "Will you let me ask you something first?" she said. "Ask. Why did you say yes?" The square was too far back now to hear them. It was just the two of them. The woman and the feared man, and the tall gray horse and Elias Blackwood looked down at Grace Holloway for a long moment before he answered. "Because I watched a whole town laugh at the bravest thing I've seen in 10 years, he said, "and somebody owed you a different answer." Grace's throat closed. "That's not a reason to marry someone," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It's a reason to say yes. Whether we marry is up to you. I told you I won't hold it against you if you walk away." "And if I don't walk away?" Something moved behind his eyes. "Then I'll keep my word," he said. "I've got a place up in the high country. It's hard ground and harder work, and I won't lie to you and say it's anything else. But you'd have a roof and your own room, and not one soul up there who'll ever laugh at you again. That much I can promise. The rest—" He paused. "The rest we'd have to find out." Grace stood very still. Somewhere behind her, the town was beginning to find its voice again, a rising hum of scandalized whispers. Annette Dunmore's high, mean laugh cut through it once, and then choked off when nobody joined her. "I don't need saving Mr. Blackwood," Grace said. "I want to make that clear right now before anything. I've been taking care of myself a long time. If you're saying yes because you feel sorry for me, I'm not." Then I'd rather you said no. I heard you the first time. A muscle worked in his jaw. I don't feel sorry for you, Miss Holloway. A man feels sorry for something that's beaten. You walked across that whole square with 300 people laughing in your face, and you never once looked down. That's not somebody to feel sorry for. He shook his head slowly. That's somebody to take your hat off to. And Grace Holloway, who had not cried in front of another human being in 4 years, felt her eyes sting and burn, and turned her face quickly toward the horse so the town would not see. Then yes, she said, before she could lose her nerve. Yes, I'll marry you. It should have ended there. A clean, astonishing thing, the most talked about moment Cottonwood Bend would have for a generation. But Grace did not know yet what she had walked into the middle of. She did not know that up on his crate and plank platform, Mayor Crane was watching the two of them shake hands with an expression that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with fear. She did not know that the 3 bachelors he'd brought to town were not really there to find wives at all. She did not know that the whole afternoon's spectacle had been a kind of cover, a friendly, neighborly reason to gather the marriageable women of 3 counties into one square, where certain men could look them over and decide which families were worth tying themselves to and which family names came attached to which parcels of land. And she did not know, could not have known, that of all the names in Cottonwood Bend, the one that had made Mayor Crane go pale was hers. Because when Crane leaned over and whispered urgently to the nearest of his guests, the well-dressed man's reply was just loud enough to carry to Hattie Voss, standing forgotten at the edge of the crowd with her bundle of mending under her arm. "Holloway," the man said, and Hattie saw his soft face go hard. "You told me there were no Holloways left." "There weren't supposed to be," Crane said. And Hattie Voss, who missed nothing, filed that away in the back of her sharp old mind and looked across the square at Grace, shaking hands with Elias Blackwood, and felt a cold finger run straight up her spine. They did not let Grace go quietly. She had barely turned from Elias when the first of them caught her arm. Pruitt, the thick-necked rancher, all his easy laughter gone, now replaced by something meaner. "You think this is funny?" he hissed. "You think you can make fools of us in front of the whole—" "Take your hand off her." Elias hadn't moved fast. He never seemed to move fast. But he was suddenly there between Grace and the rancher, and his voice was so quiet that Pruitt went still as a rabbit. "I wasn't—" Pruitt started. "Your hand," Elias said. "It's still on her arm." Pruitt let go. He stepped back and he tried to laugh it off, and it came out as a sick little cough. "You're welcome to her, Blackwood," he said, and his eyes flicked once to Grace full of poison. "You two deserve each other. That's the first true thing you've said all day," Elias replied. The crowd flinched back as Elias swung up onto his horse. Then he leaned down and held out one big scarred hand to Grace. She stared at it. "You don't have to ride up with me now," he said. "There's no shame in waiting. We can do this proper in town with a parson and 3 days' notice the way folks do. I'll come back for you Sunday." "And give them 3 days to talk me out of it," Grace said. 3 days to corner me in every alley in Cottonwood Bend, no Mr. Blackwood." She looked back once at the town that had laughed at her for 26 years, at Annette Dunmore's slack, ugly face, at Pruitt, rubbing his wrist at the mayor staring after her like she was a debt come due. "There's nothing in this town I'd cry to leave behind. Grace?" It was Hattie pushing through the crowd, her old face creased with worry. "Grace, child, a word!" Grace turned. "Hattie!" The old woman caught both her hands and pulled her close, and her voice dropped so low that only Grace could hear it. "You listen to me. Whatever this is, this man, and this marriage, you go careful. Something happened just now I didn't like. The mayor and those fancy men, when they heard your name, Grace, they went white as fresh sheets. Your name." "My name—" Grace shook her head. "Hattie, my name's not worth anything to anybody. My father died with nothing but debts." "Did he?" Hattie's eyes were sharp and frightened. "Did he now? You go careful, girl. Promise me." "I'll go careful," Grace said, not understanding half her mind already on the man and the horse and the impossible new shape of her life. "I promise. Now let me go before I lose my nerve." Hattie released her hands, but she did not look comforted. Grace turned back to Elias Blackwood and put her chapped, work-worn hand into his scarred one. He pulled her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all, and she felt how easily he lifted her. This woman, the whole town had just said no man could carry, and something fierce and disbelieving cracked open in her chest. "Hold on," Elias said. Grace took hold of his coat, and the most feared man in Montana Territory rode out of the square with the woman everyone had mocked sitting straight-backed behind him, and not one soul in Cottonwood Bend made a single sound until they were gone. They rode a long way without speaking. Grace had never been outside the bounds of town more than a mile or two in her life, and she felt the country opening up around her. Vast and silent, the only sounds the steady fall of the gray horse's hooves and the creak of leather. She kept her hold on Elias's coat, and she did not ask where they were going, and he did not tell her, and for a while that silence was the most comfortable thing she had felt in years. It was Elias who broke it. "You'll have questions," he said without turning around. "Folks always do. You can ask them now or you can ask them later. But I'll tell you up front there's some I won't answer, not because I'm hiding anything from you in particular, because I don't answer them for anybody." "The scars," Grace said quietly. "The scars are one." "I wasn't going to ask about the scars." That got him. She felt the small shift in his shoulders, the surprise he didn't voice. "No," he said. "My father had scars," Grace said. "Burns up his arms from when he was young. People used to stare, used to ask. He hated it more than anything in the world, not the scars themselves, but the asking. He used to say a scar is just a place where a body decided to keep living. He said it was nobody's business what it cost." She paused. "So, no, I'm not going to ask about your scars, Mr. Blackwood. I figure if there's something you want me to know, you'll tell me. And if there isn't, then it's a place where you decided to keep living and it's nobody's business but yours." For a long moment, Elias said nothing at all. Then, in a voice gone strangely rough, "What was your father's name?" "Samuel," Grace said. "Samuel Holloway. He's been gone 4 years now." The horse walked on, and Grace behind him could not see Elias Blackwood's face, could not see the way it had changed at the sound of that name, the way the hard jaw had tightened and the gray eyes had gone somewhere far away and old and full of pain. 4 years, Elias said at last very quietly. "He had a place east of the bend, down along the creek bottom, good water." Grace went still. "How," she said slowly, "do you know where my father's place was?" The horse kept walking. The mountains rose ahead of them, dark and enormous in the failing afternoon light. "Mr. Blackwood." Grace's heart had begun to pound for the second time that day. "I asked you a question. How do you know about my father's land?" And Elias Blackwood, the man who answered to no one, who had not spoken his own grief aloud to a living soul in years, drew a long breath and gave her the truth. "Because before he was your father," he said, "Samuel Holloway was the only friend I had left in this world. And the men who took his land are the same men who were standing on that platform today smiling, while a whole town laughed at his daughter." Grace's hands went cold on his coat. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I didn't ride into town today by accident, Grace." Elias turned finally and looked back at her over his shoulder, and his gray eyes had a fire in them she had never seen in any man. "I'm saying I've been waiting 4 years for a reason to come down off this mountain. And this afternoon in the middle of that square with the whole town braying like fools." He turned forward again, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. "Would a reason walked right up to me and asked me to marry her." The horse carried them on up toward the high dark country, and Grace Holloway held on to her new husband's coat and stared at the back of his head, and understood for the first time that she had not stumbled into a strange marriage at all. She had walked straight into the middle of something that had been waiting for her for 4 long years, And behind them, far back in Cottonwood Bend, in the lamp-lit back room of the mayor's office, 3 well-dressed men and 1 frightened mayor were already bent over a map of the creek bottoms, and the Holloway name struck through years ago had just been written back onto the land in fresh black ink. The high country swallowed them whole as the light failed, and by the time the gray horse climbed the last ridge and the ranch came into view, below them full dark had fallen, and Grace could see nothing but the shape of a house against the stars, and 1 yellow square of lamplight she hadn't expected. "There's someone here," she said. "Caleb," Elias answered. "He keeps the place when I'm gone. He's 16 and he talks too much, so I'll warn you now. You have a hired hand. I have a boy I found half-starved on the Bozeman Road 2 winters back," Elias said. "Same as I'll warn you, he's got opinions about everything and the manners of a coyote. Don't let him bully you." Grace almost laughed, and the laugh surprised her so much it died halfway out. She had not expected to find anything soft up here. She had braced herself for a cold cabin and a colder man, and instead there was a boy and a lamp left burning, and a husband who'd just told her in the dark that the whole afternoon had been 4 years in the coming. He helped her down. His hands were careful with her in a way that no one's hands had ever been, and she stood in the yard with her legs unsteady from the long ride, and looked up at the dark house, and felt for one terrible moment like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff in the night, unable to see the bottom. "Grace." Elias's voice came low beside her. "What I told you on the trail. About your father. I shouldn't have laid it on you all at once like that. Not on your wedding day before you'd even seen the place. That was a hard thing of me to do." "Then why did you?" "Because I won't start a marriage on a lie, and I won't have you find out from somebody else." He was quiet a moment. "But I'll tell you the rest in my own time and not tonight. Tonight you've earned a meal and a bed and a roof full of nobody who'll ever laugh at you. That much I promised you in the square, and that much I mean to keep. The rest can wait for morning." The door banged open before she could answer, and a boy came out onto the porch holding the lamp, high, lanky, and quick, with a shock of straw-colored hair and a face that ran through 6 expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Alarm, then suspicion, then astonishment, then something close to outrage. "Elias," the boy said. "Elias, there is a woman." "There is," Elias agreed. "You went to town for salt and nails. I came back with more than that. You came back married." Caleb's voice cracked clean up the middle. "You can't just a man doesn't just you were gone since dawn." "Caleb?" Elias didn't raise his voice. "This is Grace. She's my wife. You'll treat her like the lady of this house because that's what she is, and you'll do it starting now." The boy's mouth opened and closed. He looked at Grace, really looked the lamp throwing its light up across her tired face, and Grace braced herself automatically, the way she'd braced herself 1,000 times, for the laugh, the joke, the thing about her size. It didn't come. "You hungry, ma'am?" Caleb said instead, and there was no cruelty in it at all, only a boy's plain, awkward kindness. "There's beans. They're not... I mean, I made 'em, so they're not real good, but there's a lot of 'em." And something in Grace that had been clenched tight as a fist since 2 o'clock that afternoon came quietly loose. "I'd be grateful for the beans, Caleb," she said. "And I'll show you a thing or two about making them better tomorrow, if you'll let me." The boy grinned sudden and wide. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and bolted back inside, and Grace heard him knocking pots around and talking to himself the whole way. Elias watched her in the dark. "You're good with him," he said. "I had a brother once," Grace said simply. "About that age when we lost him. The fever year." She started toward the porch. "Beans are getting cold, Mr. Blackwood." "Elias," he said, "if we're married, you can use my name." She stopped on the step and looked back at him. "Then good night, Elias," she said. "And thank you for the answer you gave in the square. I'll spend a long time understanding why you gave it. But thank you." She went inside, and Elias Blackwood stood alone in the yard a while longer, looking up at the stars over the ranch he'd hidden in for 4 years, and for the first time since the night that had carved the scars into him, The silence around him did not feel like a grave. It felt like a beginning. He just couldn't have said yet whether it was the beginning of something good or the beginning of the reckoning he'd been waiting half a decade to start. The first week, Grace expected to be sent away. She didn't say so, but it lived in her the way old fear lives in a body. She woke before dawn each morning certain that today would be the day Elias came to his senses, the day the strange spell of the square wore off, and he looked at her across the table and remembered who she was and what the whole town knew her to be. So she did the only thing she'd ever known to do against that fear. She worked. She worked the way she had never been free to work in town, where every task was somebody else's laundry and every hour was sold. Here, the work was hers. She found a kitchen garden gone to weed and ruin behind the house, and she had it cleared and turned in 3 days, her hands bleeding and glad. She found the spring house half collapsed and the milk going sour for lack of cold, and she got Caleb to help her shore it up. She found a pantry stocked like a bachelor's pantry, which was to say, barely stocked at all, and she made what was there stretch and taste like something a person might want to eat. And she watched. She watched the way Elias moved through his own house like a guest, in it never quite settling, never quite at rest, a big man making himself small. She watched him not sleep. The walls were thin, and she heard him most nights get up and go out and stand on the porch for an hour in the cold. And she heard the particular quality of that silence, and she knew it because she'd kept that same kind of silence herself for 4 years. It was the silence of a person who could not bear to lie still with their own memory. She did not ask him about it. She had told him on the trail she wouldn't, and she kept her word. But on the 4th night when she heard the door, she got up too, and she put a kettle on, and when he came back in stiff with cold, she had coffee waiting, and she set it in front of him without a word and went back to her room. She did the same the 5th night, and the 6th. On the 7th night he was already at the table when she came out, and there were 2 cups poured. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't. I'm not good company in the middle of the night." "You're not company at all," Grace said, sitting down across from him. "You're my husband sitting in his own kitchen drinking coffee his wife made. That's not company. That's just a marriage far as I understand it." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Though I'll admit I don't understand it much. I never expected to have one." Elias looked at her across the table, the lamp low between them, and something in his hard face eased. "Neither did I," he said. "Not anymore." "Was there someone?" Grace asked it gently, the way you'd step around a hole in a floor. "Before. There wasn't there. I can see it on you. The same way Hattie says she can see things on me." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. He turned the cup in his big scarred hands. "Her name was Mary," he said at last. "We were going to be married in the spring. It'll be 8 years this fall." What happened? And Elias Blackwood, who had not told the story to a living soul, told it to his wife in the lamplight in a flat, low voice that never rose and never broke, which was somehow worse than if it had. He told her about the cattle raid, about the rustlers who'd come down out of the hills one night onto the spread where he'd been foreman 40 head driven off, and the bunkhouse set afire as a distraction, and how he'd gone out into the dark with the other men to fight them the way a foreman was supposed to. And how Mary, who he'd told to stay inside to stay safe, had come out after him with a rifle, because that was the kind of woman she was brave past sense, and how in the dark, and the smoke, and the gunfire, nobody had known, nobody had seen, and she'd been struck down by a bullet that to this day no man could say whose it was, an outlaw's, or one of their own. They never found out which, Elias said. And the town decided it didn't matter. The town decided what mattered was that I went out armed, and she followed me, and only one of us came back. They decided I'd let her die, that a man worth anything would have kept her safe, or died in her place. He turned the cup. I came to think they were right. Took me a long time to come to anything else. Some nights I'm still not sure I have. Grace sat very still. "That's why they call you what they call you," she said quietly. "The names, the stories about the outlaws who never came down off the mountain. The outlaws who never came down off the mountain are a story Caleb made up to keep folks away," Elias said, and for the first time there was the ghost of dark humor in it. "Nobody's ridden up here to rob me in 2 years. There's nothing up here worth robbing. But people would rather be afraid of a man than be sorry for him, and afraid keeps him further off. So I let the stories grow." He met her eyes. "The truth's plainer and worse. I'm not a butcher, Grace. I'm just a man who couldn't save the one person he loved and went up a mountain so he wouldn't have to watch a whole town agree it was his fault." The kettle ticked as it cooled. Grace looked at this enormous, frightening broken man across her kitchen table, and she understood him suddenly and completely, in a way she had never understood another soul. "They were wrong," she said. "Grace, no. Listen to me, because I know something about this you don't." She leaned forward. "I spent 4 years letting a whole town tell me what I was. Letting them decide. Worthless. Unlovable. A joke. And you know what I figured out washing their sheets every day with my hands bleeding? I figured out that a town will tell you anything. A town's got no soul and no memory and no fairness in it. It's just a lot of frightened people deciding to be frightened of the same thing together so they don't have to be frightened alone. They were wrong about me, Elias. Hattie always said so, and I never believed her. But I believe it now. And if they were wrong about me..." Her voice caught. "Then they were wrong about you too. You didn't kill her. You loved a brave woman, and brave women don't stay inside when the men they love are out in the dark. That's not your shame to carry. That's just grief, and you've been calling it shame for 8 years because the town told you to." Elias Blackwood stared at her, and something happened in his face that Grace would remember the rest of her life. A kind of breaking slow and terrible and necessary, the breaking of a dam that has held back too much water for too long. He did not weep. She thought watching him that he had probably forgotten how. But he put one big scarred hand flat on the table and bowed his head over it, and his shoulders shook once hard, and the silence that came out of him was the loudest grief Grace had ever heard. She did not touch him. She understood this woman who'd never been touched kindly, exactly how much a person can need to be left untouched. She just sat with him across the lamplit table and kept him company in it until the worst of it had passed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, rough. I don't..." "You don't have to be sorry for anything in this house," Grace said. "Not to me, not ever." He lifted his head and looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, something raw and astonished. "Samuel said that to me once," he said. "Your father, almost word for word, after Mary. When the whole town turned its back, he was the only one who rode up here, came up the mountain with a side of bacon and a sack of flour, and he sat right there where you're sitting, and he said, 'You don't have to be sorry for living, Elias.' And I never forgot it." He shook his head slowly. "And now here's his daughter 4 years after he's gone saying the same damn thing at the same damn table. I don't believe in much, Grace, but I'm starting to believe somebody sent you." Grace's eyes stung. "Tell me about my father," she said. "Please, the man you knew, because the one I knew was so broke down by the end I'm not sure I ever met the real one." And so Elias told her about the friend he'd had, about Samuel Holloway, who'd had the best creek bottom land in the county, and a laugh you could hear across a pasture, and a daughter he was prouder of than any man had a right to be. And Grace listened, hungry, drinking in a father she'd half forgotten, until the lamp burned low, and the window went gray with morning. It was only when the sun was nearly up that the thing they had both been circling came back around. "You said the men who took his land," Grace said, "on the trail. You said they were standing on the platform today." Elias. "I never understood what happened with my father's land. I was 22 when he died. They told me there were debts. They told me the bank took everything, and there was nothing left, and I should be grateful they didn't come after me for the rest. I believed them. I've believed them 4 years. She searched his face. Were they lying to me? Elias was quiet a long moment. "What do you remember about how he died?" he asked. "He took a fall. The old grief dull and worn smooth. Off the bluff above the creek. They said he'd been drinking, that he'd gotten into debt and into the bottle both, and he went up on the bluff one night and lost his footing in the dark." "Did your father drink, Grace?" She opened her mouth to say, "Of course that's what they told me," and stopped. Because in all her life she could not remember Samuel Holloway taking so much as a glass of whiskey. He'd hated it. His own father had drunk himself into a grave, and Samuel had sworn off it as a boy, and held to it like a religion all his days. "No," she said slowly. The cold was creeping up her spine again, the same cold she'd felt when Hattie gripped her hands in the square. "No, he never touched it. Not once in his life that I ever saw." "No," Elias agreed quietly. "He didn't. I rode with him for 15 years, and I never saw him take a drink either." The kitchen was very still. "Elias?" Grace's voice had gone thin. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you your father didn't fall off that bluff drunk," Elias said. "Because your father didn't drink, and your father knew that bluff in the pitch dark the way you know your own front step. I'm telling you that in the last month of his life, he rode up here 3 times, and every time he was more frightened than the last, and the thing he was frightened of was the men who wanted his water rights. I'm telling you he sat right there, Grace, where you're sitting now the week before he died, and he told me that if anything happened to him, I was to look after you. And that there were papers. Papers about the land, the real papers, the ones that proved it was his, free and clear, and he'd hidden them somewhere safe, because he didn't trust the bank, and he didn't trust the mayor, and he didn't trust a soul in that town." Grace's hands had gone numb, and then a week later he was dead at the bottom of the bluff. Elias said, and the bank had papers nobody'd ever seen before saying he owed 3 years of notes, and the land was sold off quiet before the dirt settled on his grave, and the men who bought it were friends of the mayor's. And I rode down into that town one time to ask one question, just one. Just where are the papers Samuel told me about? And I got told that if I knew what was good for me, I'd go back up my mountain and stay there. And so help me, Grace. His voice cracked, and the shame in it was worse than any grief. So help me I did. I went back up the mountain. I told myself there was nothing to be done, that a man with my name couldn't go up against the mayor and win, that I'd only get myself killed, and what good would that do anybody? And I let them get away with it. I let them sell off my best friend's land, and put it about that he was a drunk who fell off a bluff, and I did nothing for 4 years because I was a coward who'd already gotten one person killed and couldn't stand the thought of being the death of anybody else. Grace stared at him across the table. "Until today," she whispered. "Until today." His gray eyes burned. "Until Samuel Holloway's daughter walked across a square full of laughing fools and asked me to marry her. And I looked at her, and I thought, there it is. There's my reason. There's the one thing in the world that's worth coming down off this mountain for. Not revenge. I'm too tired for revenge. But you, Grace, getting back what was stolen from you. Clearing your father's name in front of the whole town that called him a drunk. That I can come down off the mountain for. That I'd come down for if it cost me my life." The sun broke over the ridge and filled the kitchen with hard yellow light, and Grace Holloway sat in it and felt 4 years of grief rearrange itself inside her into something else entirely, something with an edge to it, something that could cut. "The papers," she said. "My father's papers, the ones that proved the land was his. You said he hid them. Did he ever tell you where?" "No." Elias shook his head. "He never got the chance. He told me they existed, and he told me they were safe, and then he was dead before he could tell me more. I've thought about it 4 years, Grace, where a man like Samuel would hide a thing he couldn't trust to any bank or any lawyer, and I never could figure it. He didn't have a hiding place I knew of. He didn't have a friend left in town. The only thing he had—" He stopped. Grace had gone very white. "The only thing he had," she said slowly, "was a daughter he was prouder of than any man had a right to be. And a brother who died in the fever year. And a box. A box. My mother's box." Grace was on her feet now, her chair scraping back, her heart slamming. "When my father died, they let me keep almost nothing. They took the furniture, the stock, everything for the debts that I now know were never real. But there was a little wooden box of my mother's, her sewing things, buttons and thread, and her thimble, and the man from the bank looked in it and saw it was worthless and let me keep it. It wasn't worth anything to anybody. It's the only thing of my family I have left in the world." Her voice was shaking now. "It's in town, Elias. In the room I rented behind the wash house. With Hattie. I left everything I owned there when I rode up here with you." The two of them stared at each other across the brightening kitchen. "You're telling me," Elias said carefully, "that your father, who didn't trust a bank or a lawyer, or a soul in town, who needed to hide the one thing in the world that could destroy the men who wanted his land, that he might have hidden it in the one place nobody would ever think to look. A worthless sewing box going home with a daughter nobody believed was worth anything. He used to say it." Grace's hand had come up to her mouth. "Oh God, Elias, he used to say it all the time, and I never. He used to say the safest thing in the world. Gracie is a thing nobody wants. I thought he meant me. I thought it was just a thing he said to make me feel. I never thought—" She couldn't finish. Elias was already up, already reaching for his coat. "Then we're going back to town," he said. "Now in daylight. After what happened in the square, Elias, the whole town. Let the whole town watch," Elias said grimly, shrugging into the coat. "Let the mayor watch. We're not going to dig anything up or accuse anybody of anything. We're going to do the most ordinary thing in the world. A new bride's going to fetch her belongings from her old lodging and bring them home to her husband's house. There's not a man in Cottonwood Bend can say a word against it." He paused with his hand on the door. "But Grace, if that box is what we think it is, if your father really hid those papers, where I think he hid them, then the second we ride into town we're in danger. Real danger. Because there are men down there who've spent 4 years believing those papers are gone forever and that no Holloway was left to come looking. And we proved them wrong yesterday in the square in front of everybody." His jaw set. "Do you understand what I'm asking you to walk into?" Grace went to her room. She came back a moment later and she was pinning her hair up the way she pinned it for hard work, and her chin was up, and there was a light in her eyes that Elias had not seen there before, not even in the square. "My father didn't fall off that bluff," she said. "Did he, Elias?" "No," Elias said quietly. "I don't believe he did." "Then I'm not asking what you're asking me to walk into," Grace said. "I'm asking how fast that gray horse of yours can carry the both of us back down this mountain. Because somebody murdered my father and called it drink, and somebody robbed me blind and called it debt, and they have been laughing at me in that square for 4 years while they did it." Her voice did not shake. It would never shake again. "And I think it's time somebody wiped the smile off this whole town's face. Don't you?" For the first time since Grace Holloway had known him, Elias Blackwood smiled a real one, slow and dangerous and full of something that had been buried for 4 long years. "Caleb," he called toward the back of the house. "Saddle the horses, both of them. Your manners can wait." They had not gotten halfway down the mountain trail when they saw the rider coming up. Elias reined in hard and put a hand back automatic, pushing Grace behind him, and his other hand drifted toward the rifle in its scabbard, because no one rode up this trail. No one ever came up this mountain, and a rider climbing toward Blackwood Ranch at this hour was a rider with a reason. Then Grace saw the bundle clutched to the rider's chest and the bent shape of the small figure fighting a horse far too big for her, and her heart turned over. "Hattie!" she breathed. And then louder, half rising in the saddle, "Hattie!" The old woman looked up, and her face was gray with exhaustion, and something worse than exhaustion, and she hauled her borrowed horse to a stop in the middle of the trail and sat there gasping, the bundle clutched against her like the most precious thing in the world. "Grace," Hattie wheezed. "Oh, thank God I caught you before, Grace. You can't go back. Do you hear me? You can't go back down to town." "Hattie, how did you even—" "Listen to me." The old woman's eyes were wild and frightened in a way Grace had never seen. "Last night, after you rode off, I went back to clear out your room, child. I was going to keep your things safe for you, and I got there, and the door was already open, and the whole room they'd torn it apart, Grace. Every drawer pulled out. The mattress slid open. Your trunk dumped on the floor. Somebody had been through every single thing you owned looking for something." Grace's blood ran cold. "The box," she said. "Hattie, my mother's sewing box. That's just it." And now, Hattie's old hands were trembling as she pulled back the edge of the bundle she'd carried up the whole mountain. And there, wrapped in her own shawl, cradled against her chest, like a baby, was a small battered wooden box with a worn brass clasp. They tore that room apart looking for something, and they didn't take a single thing of value because there was nothing of value except, "Grace, I'd taken this 2 days ago, before any of it. You'd left it on the shelf, and I worried it'd get knocked down and broken it, being the last thing of your mother's, so I carried it home to mind it for you. It was at my place the whole time. They never found it." The old woman's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "But Grace, when I picked it up this morning to bring it to you, it was heavier than it had any right to be. A box of buttons and thread, heavy as a brick. So I opened it. I opened the bottom. There's a false bottom in it, child. And under the false bottom, there's papers all folded up tight, and I can't read more than my letters, but I read enough." She pressed the box into Grace's hands. "I read enough to see your father's name and the mayor's name and the word deed, and a word I had to puzzle out that I think says murder. And then I heard horses in the street and men's voices asking old Mrs. Pruitt which house the laundry widow lived in. And I went out my back window. Grace, an old woman, out a back window in the dark, and I took the deacon's horse without asking, and I have been riding up this mountain ever since because they are coming. They know the box wasn't in your room. They know somebody's got it. And the only 2 people in the world who'd have any reason to want it." A gunshot cracked far below them on the mountain flat and small with distance. All 3 of them went rigid. "Are sitting right here on this trail," Hattie finished in a whisper, "with the men who killed your father riding up to meet them." Elias Blackwood turned in his saddle and looked back down the long trail toward the sound of the shot, and his hand closed around the rifle, and when he spoke his voice was perfectly, terribly calm. "Grace," he said, "take Hattie in the box and ride for the high pasture. The trail forks at the dead pine go left into the rocks where a horse can't follow fast. Don't stop, don't look back. Elias, no." "That's your father's whole life in that box," Elias said, and his gray eyes met hers, and there was no fear in them at all, only the steady, terrible purpose of a man who had finally, after 4 long years, found something worth coming down off his mountain to fight for. It's your name, and his good name, and everything they stole from you. You get it somewhere safe. I'll hold the trail." "You can't hold the trail against Elias. How many shots was that? How many men?" "Enough." He was already swinging down off the gray, already pulling the rifle free, already moving to the cover of the rocks where the trail narrowed to a single horse wide. "Go, Grace. For once in your life, let somebody stand between you and the thing that's coming. Go." And Grace Holloway, with her dead father's stolen life clutched against her chest, and her new husband turning to face the men who'd killed him, looked down the mountain one last time at the dust rising now where the riders came on. 3 of them, 4 more, and understood that everything in her life had been leading to this one moment on this one trail, and that nothing would ever be the same again, no matter what happened next. She wheeled her horse toward the high rocks. "You come back to me, Elias Blackwood," she said fiercely. "Do you hear me? You come back. I didn't get a husband just to lose him on a mountain." "I aim to," Elias said, and worked the rifle's lever and settled into the rocks above the narrow trail. "Now ride." She rode, and behind her, as she drove the horses up toward the dead pine, with Hattie clinging on and the box of her father's murder held tight against her heart, Grace heard Elias Blackwood's voice ring out down the mountain. No longer quiet, no longer hidden. The voice of a man who had spent 4 years in silence and was done being silent, calling out to the killers climbing toward him with something that sounded impossibly almost like joy. "That's far enough," he called. "You came up this mountain 4 years too late, gentlemen. The Holloways are home, and so am I." The first man to round the bend died learning that the stories about Elias Blackwood were not all invented. Elias did not aim to kill him. He aimed for the horse's path, put a round into the dirt a foot ahead of the lead rider's mount, and the animal reared and screamed and dumped its rider hard into the rocks, and the 4 men behind him scattered for cover like quail. It bought him what he wanted, not blood, but time. Time and the high ground and the narrow place in the trail where 5 men could not come at one man more than 2 abreast. "Blackwood!" a voice shouted from below, ragged, furious. "Blackwood, you fool! Come down out of there! This isn't your fight!" "Funny," Elias called back. "I was just thinking it was the only fight I've got left." He shifted in the rocks, keeping low, his eyes moving over the broken ground below. "You boys want to tell me which one of you is the one who pushed Samuel Holloway off that bluff? I've waited 4 years to put a name to him." Silence from below. Then, low and ugly, a different voice one Elias knew. "You don't know what you're talking about, Blackwood." "Pruitt." Elias almost laughed. "Should have known you'd be in it. You never did have the stomach to find a wife honest, did you? You went looking for one with land attached." He worked the lever slow, the sound of it carrying. "Where's your master Pruitt? Where's Crane? Too fine to climb a mountain himself. Sent his dogs up to do it." A gun cracked and a bullet whined off the rock a hand's breadth from his head, and Elias dropped flat and let it go quiet. And in the quiet, he heard exactly what he'd been listening for, the scrape and shuffle of men trying to work around his flank up through the rocks on the left, the way men always tried when they had numbers and impatience both. He let them come. He counted the seconds the way he'd counted them on 100 night watches in his foreman years, and when the first head came up over the rocks where it shouldn't have, he put a round past its ear, close enough to part its hair, and the man yelled and fell back, and Elias rolled to new cover before the answering fire came. It was working. For now, it was working. One man, the high ground, a narrow trail. But Elias Blackwood was 37 years old, and 4 years out of practice, and not a fool, and he knew the arithmetic of it as well as anyone. 5 men, maybe 6. All the daylight in the world. And every minute that passed was a minute they spent learning the ground, finding the angles, working out that all they had to do was wait or split or fire the brush below and smoke him out. He didn't have to win. He just had to last long enough for Grace to get clear. So he settled into the rocks, and he made every shot a lesson, and he made the men below pay in fear and time for every yard of mountain. And he let his mind go just for a moment up the trail to the dead pine, where a woman he'd been married to for 1 week was riding for her life with her father's murder clutched against her chest. Grace did not go to the high pasture. She got Hattie there. She drove both horses up through the rocks past the dead pine, exactly the way Elias had told her, left into the broken country where the trail gave out and a horse had to pick its way, and she did not stop until she'd put a shoulder of the mountain between them and the sound of the guns. And there she pulled up and helped Hattie down and pressed the box into the old woman's shaking hands. "You're going on without me," Hattie said. It was not a question. The old woman's face had gone still and knowing. "Grace, child." "He can't hold them alone, Hattie." Grace's voice was perfectly steady, which frightened the old woman more than tears would have. "You said it yourself. 5 men 6. He's 1. He sent me up here to die for that box if I had to, and I will. I'll guard it with my life, but not while he bleeds out on a trail buying me the time. That's not a bargain I'll take." "You can't fight grown men with guns, you foolish girl." "No," Grace agreed. "I can't fight them." She was already turning her horse, already pulling something from the saddlebag, and Hattie saw it was no gun saw. It was the spyglass Elias kept for watching his stock, and a length of rope, and the little tin mirror from the wash kit. "But I spent 4 years learning every mean trick there is to survive in a town that wanted me gone, Hattie. And the first thing you learn is that you don't beat a stronger enemy by being stronger. You beat him by being smarter, and by knowing something he doesn't." Her jaw set. "And I know this mountain now. I've worked it a week. And those men down there are town men, Pruitt and his kind. They don't know it at all. Grace." "Mind the box," Grace said. "Go up to that stand of rock and don't come down for anybody but me or Elias. If neither of us comes by dark, you ride for Bozeman. Not Cottonwood Bend, you hear, Bozeman. Find a federal marshal. Not the local law, the federal law. Show them what's in that box. Promise me, Hattie." And the old woman, looking into the face of the girl she'd watched grow up bent and beaten under a town's contempt, saw that the bent and beaten girl was simply gone, burned clean away, and someone else was sitting the horse in her place. "I promise," Hattie whispered. "God keep you, child." Grace wheeled the horse and rode back toward the guns. She did not ride down the trail. She rode the high line, the shoulder of the mountain above the narrow place, the way she'd seen Elias's cattle drift along the ridges, and she came out at last on an outcrop of rock high above the fight, and she lay down flat on her belly in the cold, and put the spyglass to her eye, and made herself for one hard moment simply look. There was Elias pinned in the rocks below the bend, his back to the cliff, and Grace's heart clenched to see how little cover he truly had. And there were the men, she counted them, made herself count them slow, the way her father had taught her to count cattle. 2 pinning Elias from the front, keeping his head down. 3 working up through the rocks to his left, almost in position now, almost around his flank. And 1 more hanging back on horseback, watching the whole thing with the patience of a man who had all day. That one wore a good coat. That one had a soft, well-fed look, even at this distance. That one was Mayor Crane. Grace lowered the glass, and her breath went out of her slow. He'd come himself. After all, he hadn't trusted this to his dogs. The thing in that box frightened him enough that the mayor of Cottonwood Bend had ridden up a mountain to see it burned, and that single fact told Grace more than the papers themselves ever could told her. She'd been right. Told her her father had been murdered. Told her that everything came down to the next few minutes on this rock. The 3 men were almost around Elias's flank. In another minute, they'd have the angle. In another minute, they'd have him. Grace looked at the loose rock under her hands. She looked at the steep scree slope that fell away below her outcrop down toward the very rocks the 3 men were climbing through. She'd spent a week on this mountain. She knew how loose that ground was. She'd nearly gone down it herself twice fetching strays and felt the whole slope shift and slide under one wrong step. She set down the spyglass. She braced her boots against the solid rock at the lip of the outcrop. And she put both her strong, wide shoulders, the shoulders a whole town had laughed at, the shoulders Pruitt had said no man could lift over a threshold, against the largest of the loose boulders at the edge of the scree, and she pushed. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the mountain moved. The boulder went, and it took the scree with it, and the scree took the slope, and what had been a still hillside became in the space of 3 seconds a roaring gray river of stone, pouring down exactly where the 3 flanking men were climbing. Grace heard them scream over the grinding roar, heard one shout, rock slide, go back, and then nothing but the thunder of half a mountainside coming down, and the men below scrambling and falling and clawing back the way they'd come, with the stones snapping at their heels. Below her in the bend, she saw Elias's head come up, saw him realize his flank had just been swept clean, saw him understand in the space of a glance up at the outcrop exactly who had done it. And Grace, lying flat on the rock with her hands torn and her heart going like a drum, watched the man who never moved fast move very, very fast. Indeed, up out of his cover, the rifle to his shoulder, taking the 2 men in front before they understood the fight had turned, dropping one with a round through the shoulder and sending the other diving for his horse, Blackwood. The roar came from below Crane on his horse, his composure gone, at last his soft face purple with fury and fear. "You think this changes anything? You think a rock slide and a fat girl change anything? There's 100 men in that town, and one of you can't fight a whole county." And Elias Blackwood, standing now in the open, the rifle loose in his hands, looked down at the mayor of Cottonwood Bend, and his answer carried up the whole mountain. "I don't have to fight a whole county, Crane," he called. "I just have to get 1 box of papers to a federal marshal, and you just rode up a mountain in front of 5 witnesses to stop me. You want to tell me again how innocent you are?" Crane went still. Grace saw the exact moment it landed on him, the moment the mayor understood what he'd done by coming himself, by coming with guns, by chasing a newlywed couple up a mountain in broad daylight. He had spent 4 years making the murder of Samuel Holloway look like an accident, the theft of his land look like honest debt, and in one morning of panic he had undone all of it, had put his own self at the head of an armed party hunting a man and his wife, and there were witnesses, now his own men, who would say so to save their own necks. "Kill him," Crane said. His voice had gone flat and dead. Kill him and find the woman and find the box. All of it. Now." But his men were not moving. His men were looking at the half a mountain that had just come down on 3 of their own. His men were looking at the bodies in the rocks and the man standing in the open who'd dropped 2 of them in as many seconds. His men were doing the arithmetic too, and the arithmetic had changed. "Mr. Crane," said Pruitt, and his voice had a tremble in it now. "Mr. Crane, sir, with respect. Dolan's legs broke under them rocks, and Tucker's shot through. And that's a marshal's business now, what you just said. That's a hanging business I didn't sign on for." "You signed on," Crane said softly, "the day you took that land. You're in it as deep as I am, Pruitt. Every one of you. So you'll finish it, or you'll hang beside me. Now kill him." And there it was, the thing Grace had been praying for up on her rock. The crack in them. The fear turned inward. She'd seen it 100 times in town, the way frightened people turned on each other the moment the price got too high. And she watched it happen now. Among the men below. Watched Pruitt look at Crane, and Crane look at Pruitt, and every man there suddenly understand that he was roped to a murderer, and the rope was tightening. She did not give them time to decide. She put the little tin mirror up into the sun, and she caught the light, and she flashed it down the mountain in 3 long sweeps, the signal her father had taught her as a girl. The signal a rancher uses to call the hands home. 3 long flashes, meaning come in, come in, come in. And she did it. Not because there was anyone to come, but because she wanted the men below to see it. To see a flash of light from high on the mountain, where they'd thought there was only 1 woman and 1 box. To wonder in their bones how many people were up here. How many guns. How many witnesses watching them in the sights of how many rifles. "There's more of 'em," somebody below said sick. "Up on the ridge, there's a signal. There's more of 'em up there." "It's a mirror, you coward." "How do you know it's a mirror? How do you know what's up there?" Pruitt's voice was climbing toward panic. "He had a week up here married to that girl. How do you know he didn't send word down? How do you know there's not a posse on this mountain right now? I'm not dying up here for your land, Crane. I'm not." And he ran. Pruitt broke for his horse, and once 1 man broke, the rest followed the way they always do, and in the space of 10 seconds, Mayor Crane's armed party dissolved into a rout. Men scrambling onto horses, hauling their wounded, up across saddles, fleeing back down the mountain trail, with the dust rising behind them. Crane screamed at them, threatened them, drew his own pistol and waved it. But you cannot lead men who have decided to live. And one by one they left him, until the mayor of Cottonwood Bend sat alone on his horse in the middle of the trail, his fine coat gray with dust, and looked up the mountain at the 1 man still standing in the rocks above him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Elias Blackwood walked down out of the rocks, the rifle held loose and easy, and came to stand in the trail 20 feet from the man who had murdered his best friend. "Go on home, Crane," Elias said quietly. "Go on home and put on your good waistcoat and stand on your platform and smile at folks, because that's the last time you'll get to do it. There's a box headed for a federal marshal with your name in it in a dead man's handwriting, and there's 5 of your own men who'll trade you for their necks before the week's out, and there's nothing left for you to do now but run or hang." He tilted his head. "Which'll it be?" Crane's hand tightened on his pistol. "Don't," Elias said, and there was no heat in it, only a terrible certainty. "You're a town man, Crane. You've never killed anyone with your own hands in your life. You hired it done to Samuel because you couldn't stomach doing it yourself. You're not going to start with me." He took 1 step closer. "But God is my witness. If you lift that gun, you'll find out I'm not a town man. Not even a little." The mayor's hand trembled, and then, with a sound that was almost a sob, Mayor Crane wheeled his horse and fled down the mountain after his men, and the trail was empty, and it was over. Elias stood in the silence a moment, the rifle hanging from his hand, and then he turned and looked up at the outcrop, and Grace was already up, already scrambling down toward him, half running and half falling down the rocks, and he dropped the rifle and caught her as she caught her against his chest and held on. "You were supposed to ride for the high pasture," he said into her hair. His voice was not steady. The man whose voice was always steady, and it was not steady now. "You were supposed to take the box and run. I told you to run, Grace." "I did run." She was clinging to his coat, her face pressed to his shoulder, both of them shaking. "I ran and got Hattie safe, and then I ran right back, because I am not the kind of woman who lets her husband die alone on a mountain, and you'd best learn that about me now, Elias Blackwood, because it's not going to change." He pulled back enough to look at her. There was blood on her hands where the rock had torn them, and dust in her hair, and a fierce wild light in her eyes, and Elias Blackwood looked at her like a man looking at something he'd given up believing the world still made. "You brought down half a mountain," he said. "I pushed one rock," Grace said. "The mountain did the rest. My father taught me that Scree Slope was loose. Used to warn me off it when I was little, said it'd come down on me one day." Her voice cracked just slightly. "I guess he was right. It just came down on the right people instead." And Elias Blackwood laughed a real laugh, rough and disbelieving, the laugh of a man who had not laughed in years, and pulled his wife back against him and held her there in the empty trail while the dust of their enemies settled down the mountain. But the thing about a man like Crane Grace would learn was that he did not run far. Men like Crane did not flee a county and start over. They had too much of themselves sunk into the ground they'd stolen. And so even as Elias held her in the trail, even as the danger seemed past, the mayor was not riding for the territory line. He was riding for town. And he was thinking the whole way down the cold, fast thinking of a cornered man about how a thing that looks like one truth can be made to look like its opposite. If you control the only law within 50 miles and you get to the courthouse first. They didn't understand that yet, the man and his wife on the mountain. They thought they'd won the morning. They had, but the morning was the easy part. It was Caleb who brought them the news 3 days later, riding up the trail at a dead gallop, with his straw hair flying and his face white as a sheet. Grace heard him coming and came out wiping her hands, her heart already climbing into her throat, because nobody rode like that with good news. Elias came around from the barn at a run, and the boy hauled his lathered horse to a stop in the yard and tumbled off it half falling and got the words out in a rush. "They've turned it around," Caleb gasped. "Elias, they've turned the whole thing around. I went down for the flour like you said, and the whole town's talking about nothing else. Crane's gone to the territorial circuit, judge the one that comes through next week, and he's filed papers. He's filed charges." "Charges against who?" Elias's voice had gone very quiet. "Against you and her." Caleb's eyes went to Grace, stricken. "He's saying, Elias, he's saying you lured Miss Grace into a sham marriage to get at the Holloway land claim, that the two of you cooked up a forged deed to steal back property that was honestly sold years ago, and that when his men rode up here to serve a lawful eviction notice, you ambushed them, that you tried to murder them, that you caused a rock slide a purpose that broke a man's leg and shot 2 others. They came up here with guns," Grace said. "They came to kill us." "He's saying they came to serve papers, and you attacked them. And it's his word, ma'am, his and Pruitt's, and all of theirs against your two, and he's the mayor, and they've got the broke leg and the bullet wounds to show for it, and—" Caleb swallowed hard. "And there's more. The judge that's coming. Judge Harmon. Folks say he and Crane are old friends, that they came west together, that Harmon's the one signed off on the original land sale 4 years back." The yard went very still. Grace looked at Elias. Elias looked at Grace. And in both their faces was the same dawning understanding that the men who'd run from them on the mountain had not been beaten at all, had simply retreated to the one battlefield where they held every advantage. Not guns, not the mountain, but the law itself, bent and bought and waiting with a friendly judge riding in to preside over it. "The box," Grace said. "We have the box. We have my father's deed, his real deed, his own handwriting, everything. And who's going to believe it's real?" Elias said softly, and the bitterness in his voice was 4 years deep. "A deed that conveniently turns up in a sewing box, the same week the daughter marries the man with a grudge against the mayor. Crane's already got the story written, Grace. He told it first. He'll say we forged it. He'll say I, the bitter mountain man, helped Samuel Holloway's penniless daughter cook up a fake deed and a fake murder to steal back land we lost fair and square. And a judge who's Crane's own friend who signed the original sale? He stopped. His jaw worked. They didn't run from us on that mountain. They just changed the ground. They picked a fight we can't win with rocks and rifles and dragged it down into a courtroom where Crane owns the floor and the walls and the man behind the bench. Grace stood in the yard with her father's box safe in the house behind her, the box that proved everything. The box she'd nearly died for, and felt the bottom drop out of the world. Because she understood now the thing her father must have understood in the last frightened month of his life. That the papers alone were not enough. That truth alone was not enough. That in a town where one man owned the law, a stolen deed, and a faked murder could be made as solid as granite, and an honest woman's honest claim could be made to vanish like breath on a cold morning, and that the only thing more dangerous than having no proof at all was having proof that a corrupt court would simply rule a forgery in front of the whole county, and brand you a liar and a thief forever in the bargain. He's going to put us on trial, she said slowly, in front of the whole town that laughed at me. He's going to stand us up there and prove we're liars and thieves, and there's a judge already bought to do it. And when it's over, they won't just take the land. They'll take my father's name, his good name. They'll make it law forever that Samuel Holloway was a drunk and a debtor, and his daughter's a forger and a fraud. Grace. No. She turned on him, and the fear was there in her face. But underneath the fear was something harder, the same thing that had walked her across the square, the same thing that had pushed the boulder. No. He thinks he's clever taking it to a courtroom. He thinks the law is his. But a courtroom's got more than one judge in it, Elias. It's got a record. It's got witnesses under oath. It's got a higher court somewhere above the one he bought. Her mind was already racing, already cold and fast. Caleb. This Judge Harmon. When does he ride the circuit and exactly when? 6 days, ma'am. He holds court in the Bend a week from Thursday. 6 days. Grace nodded slowly, and Elias watched something settle over his wife's torn and dusty face that frightened him almost as much as the men on the mountain had a terrible focused calm. Then we have 6 days. 6 days to find out everything there is to know about Judge Harmon and the day my father's land was sold. 6 days to turn one box of papers into a wall they can't get around. 6 days to learn the law better than the men who think they own it. She looked up at her husband. You came down off your mountain to clear my father's name, Elias. Well, they just told us exactly where they're going to try to bury it for good. In a courtroom a week from Thursday in front of the whole town. Her chin came up. So that's where we'll clear it. In their own courtroom. With their own bought judge sitting right there watching. Where every soul in Cottonwood Bend can see. The wind came down off the high country and moved across the yard, and the three of them stood in it, the feared man, the boy he'd saved, and the woman a whole town had mocked. And far below them in Cottonwood Bend, in the lamplit back room of the courthouse, Mayor Crane sat across a desk from an old friend in a black coat and slid a folder of papers across the wood and began very quietly to explain exactly how the daughter of Samuel Holloway was going to be made to stand up in open court and be branded a liar in front of every person who had ever laughed at her. He was smiling when he said it. He would not be smiling for long. They spent the first of their 6 days reading. Grace spread her father's papers across the kitchen table and went through them the way she'd once gone through a town's worth of dirty laundry, methodically item by item, missing nothing. The real deed in Samuel Holloway's own slanting hand, witnessed and dated and clear. A letter half finished that Samuel had never sent, addressed to a territorial land office in Helena, complaining that men were pressuring him to sign over his water rights and that he feared for his safety. And a single page of figures columns of dates and dollar amounts that Grace stared at for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. Elias, she said slowly, come look at this. He came and stood over her shoulder. These are payments, Grace said. Look, dates going back 5 years. And every one of them's the same money paid out regular as rent from a ranch account to a name. She put her finger on it. M. Harmon, Elias. My father was paying money to a Harmon every quarter for 5 years before he ever died. Elias went very still. Judge Harmon, he said. Or a kin of his. Grace's mind was working fast. But why would my father, he hated owing anybody. Why would he be paying a judge money quarter after quarter? She frowned at the page. Unless he wasn't paying him. Unless this is a record of someone paying the judge, and my father got hold of it. Kept it. Hid it in the box with everything else because he knew. Her breath caught. Because he knew it was the one thing that mattered. Not the deed, Elias. They can call the deed a forgery. But this a record of the judge taking money in my father's hand dated years before any of this. This isn't about my father's land at all. This is proof the judge was bought long before my father ever died. Which means, Elias said slowly, that Samuel didn't just stumble onto men who wanted his water. He stumbled onto something bigger. A judge on the take. A mayor and a judge, and God knows who else running land out from under honest folks for years with the law itself in their pocket. And he was going to expose it. Grace looked up at her husband, and the grief and the fury in her were one thing now inseparable. That's why they killed him, Elias. Not for one creek bottom. For everything he knew. He found out the judge was bought, and he was going to write to Helena, and they couldn't let him. The two of them sat in the lamplight with the proof of it between them, and Grace understood at last, and all the way down, exactly how much her father had been carrying in the last frightened month of his life, and exactly how alone he had been carrying it. He never told me any of it, she said softly. He must have been so afraid. And he never told me a word because he was trying to keep me out of it. To keep me safe. Her voice broke for the first time. And it didn't work, Elias. They came for me anyway. 4 years later, they tore my room apart looking for this box. He died to protect me, and it didn't even work. Elias put his big scarred hand over her torn one on the table. It worked for 4 years, he said quietly. 4 years you were safe because he hid this so well, not one of them could find it. And now you've got it, and you're not alone with it the way he was. That's the difference, Grace. He fought them alone. You won't. His hand tightened. Whatever happens a week from Thursday, you walk into that courtroom with a husband beside you, and an old woman who'll swear to where that box was, and a record in your father's own hand. He had none of that. You've got all of it. We finish what he started. Together. That's how it works now. Grace turned her hand over under his and held on. Then we'd better learn the law, she said, because a record's only as good as the court that reads it, and Crane's bought the court. It was Hattie of all people who knew the way around that. She'd refused to go back to town. Said an old woman who'd climbed out a back window and stolen a deacon's horse wasn't likely to get a warm welcome, and so she'd stayed up at the ranch, and she sat now by the stove with a cup of Grace's coffee and listened to the two of them talk themselves in circles about a bought judge, and finally she set down her cup with a click that stopped them both. "You're going at it backwards," Hattie said. They looked at her. "You keep saying Harmon's bought. Harmon's Crane's friend Harmon signed the sale," the old woman said. "So you're trying to figure how to win in front of a judge who's already decided against you. That's a fool's errand, and you both know it. You can't beat a crooked judge by being righter than him. He doesn't care who's right." She fixed Grace with her sharp old eyes. "But I'll tell you what a crooked judge does care about. The same thing every crooked man cares about. Getting caught. There's always somebody above a circuit judge child. There's a territorial Supreme Court up in Helena. There's a federal marshal. There's a governor who'd love nothing better than a scandal to hang on the men who didn't back him. A crooked judge can rule any way he likes in his own courtroom, long as nobody's watching who can touch him." She leaned forward. "So you don't try to win his courtroom. You make sure the right people are watching it. You make the trial itself the trap." Grace stared at her, and slowly the whole shape of it began to come clear. "A federal marshal?" she breathed. "You told me that day on the trail, you told me if it went wrong, I should ride for Bozeman and find a federal marshal, not the local law. Because the local law is Crane's," Hattie said. "But the federal law isn't. Land fraud across a territory forged, deeds a judge taking money that's not a county matter, child. That's federal. You get a federal marshal in that courtroom sitting quiet in the back, and you let Crane and Harmon run their crooked trial right in front of him, every lie under oath. The judge ruling against plain evidence, and you don't have to win the trial at all. You just have to lose it slow enough and loud enough that a federal man sees exactly how it's rigged. Then it's not your word against the mayor's anymore. It's a U.S. Marshal's word. And there's not a bought judge in the territory can touch that. The kitchen was silent. That's... Elias started and stopped and looked at the old woman with something like awe. Hattie, that's either the smartest thing I've ever heard or the most dangerous. It's both, Hattie said placidly, picking her coffee back up. Most good plans are. It only works if we can get a marshal there. Grace said, her mind racing ahead. And get him there without Crane knowing. If Crane gets wind, there's federal eyes coming, he'll postpone, or he'll change his story, or he'll just have us killed before Thursday and call it something else. She turned to Caleb, who'd been sitting wide-eyed in the corner through all of it. Caleb, how fast can you ride to Bozeman and back without being seen leaving town? The boy was on his feet before she finished. Fast, ma'am. There's a back way down. The north slope comes out past the Hendricks place. Nobody'd ever I can be in Bozeman by tomorrow night. Then you're going to Bozeman, Grace said. You're going to find the federal marshal's office, and you're going to ask for a man named... She looked at the half-finished letter again, the one her father had addressed to the land office in Helena. There's a name here. A land office agent my father was trying to reach. Pemberton. You ask for Marshal's office. You tell them Samuel Holloway's daughter has evidence of land fraud and a bought territorial judge, and you tell them the trial is a week from Thursday in Cottonwood Bend, and you bring back any man with a federal badge who'll come. And if they won't come on a boy's word? Elias asked quietly. Grace looked at the box. Then, after a moment, she took out the single page of figures, the record of payments to Harmon, and she folded it small and pressed it into Caleb's hand. Grace, Elias said sharply. That's our proof. If that's lost, it's no proof at all if no marshal comes, Grace said. A copy stays here, but the marshal needs to hold something real in his hand, or he'll think it's a boy's tall tale. This is the thing that'll bring him. She closed Caleb's fingers around it. Guard it with your life, Caleb. Don't show it to a soul, but a federal man, and come back to us. The boy looked at the folded paper in his fist, and then up at the woman who'd shown him how to make beans worth eating, and his young face went hard and proud and frightened all at once. Yes, ma'am, he said. I won't let you down. He rode out on the north slope an hour before dark, and Grace stood in the yard and watched him go until the mountain swallowed him, and Elias came and stood beside her. And neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, that they had just sent a 16-year-old boy down a mountain alone, carrying the one piece of paper that could save or doom them all into a county where powerful men were hunting for exactly that paper. He'll make it, Elias said. He has to, Grace answered. The days that followed were the longest of Grace's life. They prepared the way a body prepares for a flood it can see coming and cannot stop. Grace read every paper 100 times until she knew them cold, until she could quote dates and figures in her sleep because she had decided, and Elias had not been able to talk her out of it, that she would speak for herself in that courtroom. No lawyer. There wasn't one in the county Crane didn't own, and she would not put her father's truth in a bought mouth. You don't know the law, Elias argued. Crane'll twist you up. Harmon'll throw out everything you say on some rule you never heard of. Then I'll learn the rules, Grace said. And she did, sitting up half the night with a battered book of territorial statutes that Hattie of all people had thought to grab off a shelf in the courthouse anteroom the last time she'd been forced to wait there. Grace read it the way she read everything slow and complete and missing nothing, and by the fourth night she could talk about admissibility and chain of evidence and the jurisdiction of the territorial courts, and Elias stopped arguing and started helping her practice. Instead playing Crane, playing Harmon, throwing every cruel, twisting question he could think of at her across the kitchen table until she could meet them all without flinching. But underneath the preparing, something else was happening between them, something neither of them had words for, and neither of them named. It was in the way Elias started rising before her now, so the kitchen was warm when she came out. The way Grace started laying out his coffee without being asked. The way they fell asleep in their separate rooms with the wall between them, and woke knowing the other was there, and found somewhere in the long, terrible days that the wall had become the thinnest thing in the world. On the fifth night, Grace couldn't sleep. She came out to find Elias at the table, the lamp low, her father's deed in his hands, and he was just looking at it. The careful, slanting hand of the dead friend who'd once climbed a mountain to tell him he didn't have to be sorry for living. "I keep thinking," Elias said, not looking up, about what he'd say. Samuel. If he could see this. His daughter married to the butcher of Bitter Creek, fixing to take on the whole rotten works of this county with a sewing box and a statute book. A rough sound that was almost a laugh. "He'd probably think I dragged you into it. You didn't drag me into anything." Grace sat down across from him in the place that had become hers. "I walked across that square on my own 2 feet, Elias. I asked you. Remember, you keep talking like you came down off your mountain and pulled me into your war. But it was the other way around. I'm the one who walked up to you." She reached across the table and took the deed gently from his hands and set it down. "And I'd do it again, knowing all of it. The fire on the mountain, the trial, all of it. I'd walk across that square and ask you again tomorrow." Elias looked at her in the lamplight. "Why?" he asked. And it was not the hard, unreadable man of the square asking. It was someone underneath, that someone who had been alone a very long time. You could have asked any man in 3 counties eventually once they saw you. Once they knew you the way I've come to know you. Why'd you walk up to the one man everybody was afraid of? Grace was quiet a long moment. "Because nobody else would have said yes," she said at last. "And I knew it. I knew when I started walking that every one of those soft, easy men would laugh in my face. I wasn't brave, Elias, not the way everybody thinks. I walked toward you because you were the only one in that whole square who looked as alone as I felt. I thought, there's a man who knows. There's a man who knows what it is to have a whole town decide what you are. And I thought, if I'm going to be laughed at no matter what, let me at least be laughed at standing next to somebody who understands." Her voice dropped. "I didn't expect you to take your hat off. I didn't expect you to say yes. I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect you." Elias reached across the table and took her hand, her torn, work-worn, capable hand in both of his scarred ones. "I spent 8 years sure I'd never feel anything but sorry again," he said roughly. "Sorry I lived. Sorry I couldn't save her. Sorry every morning I woke up and she didn't." His grip tightened. "And then a woman walked across a square and asked me to marry her, and I haven't felt sorry once since. Not one morning. That's what you gave me, Grace. You didn't give me a wife to cook and clean. You gave me back the part of me that died on that other mountain 8 years ago. And whatever happens Thursday, whatever that crooked court does to us, I need you to know that you already gave me back my life before you ever knew you were doing it." Grace's eyes filled, and for once she let him see it. "Then we've got something worth fighting for," she whispered. "Both of us. Together." And she did not pull her hand away, and neither did he. And they sat like that a long while in the lamplight. Not the feared man and the mocked woman the town had made them, but simply 2 people who had found late, and against all odds, the one thing each of them had stopped believing they'd ever have. Caleb came back on the 6th day, half dead in the saddle, his horse blown, and Grace ran to him with her heart in her throat. "Did you find him?" she demanded, helping the swaying boy down. "Caleb, the marshal. Did you find him?" "Found him." The boy could barely stand. "Marshal name of Dawes, federal man. Grace, he knew the name. Pemberton, the land agent your pa was writing to. He knew it. Said Pemberton had been after a ring of land fraud in this territory for 2 years, and could never get inside it, never get proof, never get a witness who'd live long enough to testify." Caleb's eyes were shining despite his exhaustion. "He took one look at that paper your pa wrote, and he went white, and he said, this is it. This is the thing we couldn't get. He's coming, Grace. He's coming to the trial. Him and 2 deputies. They'll ride in quiet the morning of, mixed in with the circuit crowd. Nobody'll know 'em from drovers." He said, the boy grinned, swaying. He said, "Tell Samuel Holloway's daughter to put on the trial of her life and to keep that judge talking, and he'll do the rest." Grace closed her eyes. For 4 years she had carried her father's death like a stone she couldn't set down. For 4 years a whole town had laughed at her and called her worthless, and a whole county had called her father a drunk who fell off a bluff. And now, finally, the law itself, the real law, the federal law, the law above the bought one, was riding toward Cottonwood Bend to sit in the back of a crooked courtroom and watch. "Then we have everything we need," she said. "Almost." "Almost?" Elias asked. Grace opened her eyes, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Not just resolve, but a kind of cold, strategic clarity that would have frightened Mayor Crane to his bones if he'd seen it. A marshal in the back of the room only matters if Crane and Harmon run the crooked trial they're planning, she said slowly. If they get cautious, if they suspect there's federal eyes watching, they'll play it straight, and a straight trial in front of a careful judge, we might still lose, because it's our word against 5 men's, and the deed can be called a forgery. No. She shook her head. We don't just need the marshal to watch. We need Crane and Harmon to hang themselves. We need them so sure they've already won. So sure there's nobody watching who matters that they get bold. That they say the things out loud they'd never say if they knew. Her jaw set. We need them to think we're beaten. We need them to think I'm exactly the stupid, worthless, hopeless woman this whole town's always said I am. Walking into court alone, no lawyer, no chance, ready to be slaughtered. She looked at Elias. And that means when we ride into Cottonwood Bend Thursday morning, you can't ride in beside me looking like a man with a plan. You have to look beaten too. You have to look like the butcher of Bitter Creek dragged into a court he can't win, sullen and silent and finished. Because if Crane believes for 1 second that we've got something, that there's a card we haven't played, he'll find a way to stop the trial before we ever get to play it. The kitchen was silent. Elias studied his wife's face and slowly understood what she was asking of him. You want me to walk into that courtroom, he said, and let the whole town watch them tear you apart. Let them call you a liar and a thief and a forger to your face. Let them call your father a drunk. And do nothing. Sit there and do nothing while it happens. Until the right moment, Grace said. Yes. Grace, it's the only way. Her voice was steady, but her eyes pleaded with him. I know what I'm asking. I know it's the hardest thing in the world for you to sit still while someone hurts me after Mary after everything. I know. But that's exactly why it'll work, Elias. The whole county knows the butcher of Bitter Creek would never sit quiet while someone shamed his wife. So when you sit there silent and beaten, Crane will believe it. He'll believe he's truly won, and he'll get bold. He'll say too much, and the marshal in the back of the room will hear every word. She reached for his hand. I need you to be silent one more time. The last time. And then never again. Can you do that for me? Can you sit still and trust me to fight the way you've been asking me to trust you to fight all along? And Elias Blackwood, the man who had spent 8 years learning that staying silent while the people he loved got hurt was the worst sin a man could commit, looked at the woman who was asking him to do exactly that one last time on purpose as a weapon, and understood that this was the truest test of trust he had ever been handed. I can do it, he said hoarsely. God help me, Grace, I can do it. But you'd best win, because the second that trial's over, win or lose, I am never sitting silent again as long as I live. Not for anybody, not for any reason. I know, Grace said softly. That's the man I married. They rode into Cottonwood Bend on Thursday morning, into a town that had been waiting for them like a crowd waits for a hanging. Word had gone everywhere. The whole county had turned out the same faces from the square, Annette Dunmore and her sister Pruitt's people, ranchers and merchants and farmers' wives, all of them packed into the courthouse and spilling out the doors. All of them come to see the butcher of Bitter Creek and the laundress who'd shamed them get what was coming. Grace felt their eyes as she climbed down from the horse, felt the old familiar weight of 300 people deciding what she was, and she made herself small and frightened-looking, and beaten exactly the way she'd planned. And beside her, Elias walked in, sullen and silent, with his hat low, and his shoulders down, the very picture of a dangerous man brought low. And up at the front behind the bench sat Judge Harmon in his black coat, an old man with a face like a closed ledger. And beside the prosecutor's table stood Mayor Crane in his very best waistcoat. And when Crane saw Grace come in alone, no lawyer head down, he smiled. He actually smiled. Grace saw it and felt the cold satisfaction of it settle into her bones because that smile told her everything. He thought he'd won. He thought she was exactly what the town had always said. She found a seat at the front alone, her father's box of papers held in her lap. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look for the 3 quiet drovers who'd come in with the morning crowd and taken seats at the very back of the room, did not let her eyes go anywhere near the federal marshal named Dawes and his 2 deputies. She kept her head down and her hands folded, and she waited beaten and worthless exactly as planned. "This court is now in session," Judge Harmon intoned. "The Honorable Judge Harmon presiding. We are here in the matter of the territory and Mayor Josiah Crane against Elias Blackwood and Grace Holloway Blackwood on charges of conspiracy, forgery, fraud, and attempted murder." He peered down over his spectacles, and his old eyes found Grace, and there was contempt in them, plain and certain. "I see the defendants have chosen to appear without counsel. The woman intends to speak for herself. Is that correct?" Grace stood. She kept her voice small and uncertain. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, "if it please the court." "It does not particularly please the court," Harmon said, and a ripple of laughter went through the crowd, the old familiar laughter, the laughter of the square, and Grace let it wash over her, and kept her head down, and felt Elias go rigid beside her, and prayed he'd hold. "But it is your right, however ill-advised. Mr. Crane, you may present the territory's case." And Mayor Crane stepped forward, smiling. Certain bold as a man can only be when he believes with his whole heart that no one is watching who matters, and began in the warm, reasonable voice of a man who owned the room to tell the courtroom exactly how Samuel Holloway's worthless daughter and her murderer husband had forged a dead man's name to steal land that honest men had bought fair and square. He had no idea he was talking straight into the ears of a federal marshal, and Grace Holloway sat with her head down and her father's truth in her lap and let him talk. Crane talked for the better part of an hour, and every word he spoke was a nail in his own coffin, though he didn't know it. He told the courtroom that Samuel Holloway had been a drunkard and a debtor who'd drunk away his land and then fallen off a bluff in his cups. He told them the bank had lawfully foreclosed, and honest men had lawfully bought the property. He told them that 4 years later, the dead man's penniless daughter had conspired with a violent recluse to forge a false deed and a false tale of murder, and that when lawmen rode up the mountain to serve an eviction, the pair of them had ambushed the party and crippled good men with a deliberate rockslide. He laid it all out, warm and reasonable, and the crowd nodded along, and Judge Harmon nodded along, and Grace sat with her head bowed and let him build the whole tall structure of his lies, one beam at a time. "And so, Your Honor." Crane finished spreading his hands. "I ask this court to do the only just thing. Confirm the lawful sale. Reject this forged deed as the fraud it plainly is, and hold these 2 accountable for the violence they did to men who were only doing their lawful duty. The whole county has watched this woman make a spectacle of herself, first in our square, now in our court. It's time it ended." He sat down to a murmur of approval, and Harmon turned his cold old eyes on Grace. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "you may respond, though I'll remind you this court has no patience for theatrics, and a great deal of evidence already weighs against you." Grace rose slowly. She let them see her hands tremble. She let her voice come out small, and she watched Crane settle back in his chair with that little satisfied smile, watched Harmon's lip curl, watched the whole town lean in to enjoy the slaughter. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I'm not a lawyer. I'm a laundress. I don't know all the rules of this court." A few snickers from the crowd. She let them come. "But I've got some papers that belong to my father, and I'd like to show them to the court if I'm allowed. That's all, just to show them." "The forged deed," Crane said almost gently to the room. "Your Honor, we've established—" "Not the deed," Grace said. Something else first, if it please the court. Harmon waved a bored hand. Show your papers then. Let's be done with it. And Grace Holloway reached into her father's box and drew out not the deed they were all expecting, but a single page of figures, and she held it up and her voice changed. It was a small thing, the change. But Crane heard it. The trembling was gone. The smallness was gone. And the woman standing at the front of the courtroom was suddenly not beaten at all. "This is a record in my father's hand," Grace said, and her voice carried now to every corner of the packed room. Dates and amounts going back 5 years before he died. Quarterly payments. And the name they were paid to. She paused. "The name is M. Harmon." The courtroom went still. Up on the bench, Judge Harmon's bored expression did not change, but his hand resting on the rail went white at the knuckles. "My father wrote this down," Grace went on, "because my father found out that the circuit judge for this territory had been taking money for years to rule the way certain men wanted him to rule, to sign off on land sales that weren't honest, to look the other way, while families got pushed off ground that was theirs free and clear. My father found the proof of it, and he was going to send it to the territorial land office in Helena to a man named Pemberton." She drew out the half-finished letter. "This is the letter, unfinished, because he never got to finish it, because a week after he started writing it, he was dead at the bottom of a bluff. Everybody suddenly decided he was too drunk to climb my father, who never took a drink in his life. Your Honor." Crane was on his feet, and the warm reasonableness had cracked clean down the middle. "These are obvious forgeries, fabrications. The woman is slandering the bench itself." "Sit down, Mr. Crane," Harmon said, and his voice was not quite steady. "Your Honor, I must protest. I said sit down." Harmon's eyes had gone hard and frightened, and he turned them on Grace, and there was murder in them, now the cold panic of a cornered man. "Mrs. Blackwood, these documents are not in evidence and will not be entered. This court will not entertain wild accusations against its own officer. I am ruling these papers inadmissible. Bailiff, take them from her." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Even the townsfolk who'd come to laugh felt the wrongness of it, a judge throwing out evidence before he'd so much as glanced at it. And Grace, instead of fighting it, did the most dangerous thing she could have done. She smiled. "Of course, Your Honor," she said clearly. "I understand. You can't allow papers into evidence that show you've been taking money. That makes perfect sense. A bought judge would have to rule them inadmissible. He wouldn't have any choice." She turned slowly to face the packed room, the whole county, every soul who'd ever laughed at her. "I just wanted everyone here to understand exactly what they're watching. A judge who took money to murder my father's good name, throwing out the proof of it without even reading it to protect the man who paid him. I wanted it said out loud in front of everybody, so nobody could ever say it wasn't." "That is enough," Harmon roared on his feet, now his composure gone entirely. "Bailiff, I am holding this woman in contempt. Clear the court. Crane, I want these two in a cell tonight, and I want those papers burned." And from the very back of the courtroom, a calm, carrying voice said, "I wouldn't do that, Judge." Every head in the room turned. A lean, weathered man in a dusty coat was rising from his seat at the back, and as he rose, he reached into that coat and drew out something that caught the light, a federal marshal's badge, and pinned it where the whole room could see. 2 more men stood up on either side of him, badges shining, and the 3 of them had the easy, certain stillness of men who had heard every single word. "Marshal Dawes," the lean man said. "United States Marshal Service. And I'll tell you, Judge Harmon, I've been trying to catch this territory's land ring for 2 years, and I never could get one honest witness to live long enough to talk." He started walking up the aisle unhurried, and the crowd parted before him in dead silence. And then a 16-year-old boy rode into my office holding a piece of paper that a dead man wrote in his own hand. And I came up here to see for myself. He stopped before the bench and looked up at the judge, and his voice went flat and cold as winter. "And I just watched the territorial circuit judge try to burn evidence of his own corruption in open court in front of 100 witnesses after refusing to read it. I'd say that's about the most honest thing you've done in 5 years, Harmon, because now I don't need that paper to prove a thing. I've got a courtroom full of people who just watched you do it." Mayor Crane's face had gone the color of ash. "Marshal," he said, and his voice shook. "Marshal, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm a public servant. Josiah Crane." Dawes didn't even look at him. "Pemberton's office has had your name for a year. We just never had the man above you." He nodded up at the white-faced judge. "Now we do. And a judge will trade a mayor for his own neck about as fast as a mayor traded a dead rancher for a creek bottom. Won't he, Judge Harmon?" And Harmon, looking down at the marshal, looking out at the courtroom full of people who had watched him try to burn the truth, did exactly what Grace had known a cornered, frightened, guilty man would do. He looked at Crane and he said, "It was his idea, all of it. The Holloway business, Crane brought it to me. Crane and his men handled the bluff. I only signed the papers. You lying old—" Crane lunged toward the bench, and Dawes's deputies had him by both arms before he'd taken 2 steps, and the courtroom erupted, and through all of it, through the shouting and the chaos and the gavel pounding uselessly on the bench, Grace Holloway stood perfectly still at the front of the room and watched 4 years of grief and lies come crashing down in the space of a single minute. It was over almost before the town understood it had begun. Dawes and his deputies took Crane and Harmon both into federal custody before noon. Pruitt and the others, faced with a U.S. Marshal and a hanging business charge, fell over themselves to confess, each one trading the next, each one swearing it was Crane who'd planned the murder of Samuel Holloway Crane, who'd ordered the bluff Crane, who'd forged the foreclosure papers that stole the land. Within a week, the whole rotten structure that had ruled Cottonwood Bend for years had come apart at every joint, and the federal court up in Helena would spend the better part of a year sorting through land stolen from a dozen families, not just the Holloways. And the deed, Samuel Holloway's real deed in his own slanting hand, the one Harmon had tried to call a forgery, was confirmed by the federal court as genuine beyond any question. Blackwood Ranch and the Holloway Creek bottom both restored free and clear to Grace and Elias Blackwood. But the thing Grace would remember was not the verdict. It was the moment in the chaos of that courtroom when Elias Blackwood finally stood up. He'd kept his word. Through the whole long morning he'd sat silent and beaten while they called his wife a liar and his friend a drunk, his jaw set, his hands knotted, trusting her, holding the hardest silence of his life. And now, with Crane in irons, and Harmon broken, and the whole town reeling, Elias rose to his feet in the front of the room, and the crowd went quiet because the butcher of Bitter Creek had risen and nobody knew what he might do. He looked out at them, at Annette Dunmore, at Pruitt being led away in chains, at the mayor who'd murdered his friend, and the judge who'd sold the truth, at the whole town of Cottonwood Bend that had laughed at a brave woman in its square not 3 weeks gone. And then Elias Blackwood spoke, not in the low, dangerous voice they were all afraid of, but in something quieter and worse, something that landed on every guilty face in that room. "You laughed at her," he said. "Every one of you. You stood in that square, and you laughed while a woman braver than the whole pack of you put together asked to be treated like she mattered. And not 3 weeks later, that same woman walked into this court alone, with no lawyer and no friend in this town, but an old widow, and she brought down the men who've been robbing and killing you for years. She did that. For you. For all of you who laughed." He shook his head slowly. "The only shame in this town was never Grace Holloway. The only shame in this town is how you treated the best soul among you." The courtroom was silent, and then Grace was at his side, her hand finding his, and Elias looked down at her, and right there in front of the whole staring town, the most feared man in Montana Territory bent and kissed his wife, not for show, not for spite, but because he could not have stopped himself if his life had hung on it. Hattie Voss, watching from the second row, wiped her old eyes and said to no one in particular, "Well, about time." The years that followed were good ones, and they were earned. Grace did not waste her time on bitterness. The town that had mocked her came slowly, shamefaced, to apologize. The mayor's office sent a formal letter. The new and honest mayor read it aloud at a gathering, and Annette Dunmore herself, older and humbler, stopped Grace on the street one day and could not get through her apology without weeping. Grace heard her out. Grace forgave her. But Grace did not pretend, and she did not forget, and she built her life from that day forward on a single quiet principle her father had left her in a box, that the safest, truest things in the world are the ones nobody thinks are worth anything. She turned the Holloway Creek bottom and Blackwood Ranch into something the territory had never seen. With the land restored and the cattle thriving, Grace opened her home to the people the world had thrown away. Widows with nowhere to go, women fleeing hard men, orphaned boys, half-starved on the Bozeman Road the way Caleb had once been. There was always a bed at Blackwood Ranch, always a place at the table, always work for willing hands and dignity for those who'd been told they had none. And Elias, who had hidden alone on a mountain for 4 years, sure his life was over, spent the rest of it teaching half-grown boys how to be men, how to work honest ride straight, and never ever stand silent while someone weaker got hurt. Caleb grew into the foreman of the whole operation and married a girl from the next county over and named his first son Samuel. And on the anniversary of the day she'd walked across the square, Grace and Elias rode down into Cottonwood Bend, together the way they did every year. And they stood in the very spot where 300 people had once laughed at a laundress for daring to want a life. "I keep thinking about that day," Grace said, looking around the quiet square. "How sure I was I'd lose everything by walking across this ground. How sure everyone was." She smiled. "And how I'd already lost everything anyway years before and just didn't know there was anything left to fight for." "You knew," Elias said. "You walked across it. That's knowing." Grace looked up at her husband, at the hard, weathered face that had frightened a whole territory, that she now knew better than her own, at the scars she'd never once asked about, and the eyes that no longer woke before dawn, unable to lie still. "I thought I was asking for a husband that day," she said softly. "I thought that was the most I could hope for. Somebody to stop the town from laughing. Somebody to keep me from spending my whole life over a wash line." Elias took her hand, the strong, capable, work-worn hand that had pinned wet sheets and pushed down a mountain and held a courtroom spellbound, and he pressed it to his chest. "You didn't ask me for a husband, Grace," he said. "You asked me a question in front of a town that wanted you broken, and you stood there and waited for the answer with your chin up while they all howled. And I took off my hat, and I said yes, because for the first time in 8 years, I'd seen something worth saying yes to." His voice went rough. "You think you got a husband out of that square? You didn't. You gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to come down off that mountain and live the rest of it like a man instead of a ghost. That's what happened in this square. Not a wedding, a resurrection." Grace's eyes filled, and this time she did not bother to hide it, because there was no one left in her life she had to hide it from. "Then we got the same thing," she whispered. "Both of us. We both got our lives back." "We did," Elias said. "Now let's go home." And they rode out of Cottonwood Bend together, the feared man and the woman everyone had once mocked, side by side across the open country, toward the ranch full of saved and gathered souls who called it home, and not one person in that town ever laughed at Grace Holloway again, because every soul in the territory had finally learned the thing her father had known all along, and died to prove that a person's worth is never measured by their face, or their size, or their reputation, or the cruel certain judgment of a frightened crowd, but only by the courage they carry in their heart, and the love they are brave enough to offer a world that has given them every reason not to. Grace Holloway had carried more of both than anyone who ever laughed at her, and in the end, that courage and that love did not just save her, they redeemed an entire town that never deserved her, and that is exactly how she wanted it.